This section is called Seldom Taught Stories of the Jews in the Middle Ages. So this covers the rise of Christianity, the Crusades, the years between 1200 and 1492 AD, England, Spain, and then England again. So the Crusades. After Islam swept into Byzantium, they just kept coming. In the late 1000s, there was a radical Islamic group that came up out of Africa and into Spain, creating a bit of trouble for the Jews. So, like we said a minute ago, they began to migrate. Some went to North Africa, and actually a few returned to Palestine, but others went to northern Spain and France and up into Germany. And there were small Jewish communities there already, but now there's this greater number of Jews entering what was considered a Christian Europe. And it's the first time that this has happened. And at first, the Jewish people were welcomed in by the Christian groups because the Jews brought in knowledge and prosperity. And at that time, the Islamic Empire was far more advanced than these backward European nations who were basically just coming out of the Dark Ages, even though that's kind of the opposite of what we think today. It was a feudal society, like where the Lord owns a castle and he had all the lands around it and the peasants farmed for him. The lords wanted to expand their holdings, but they needed money to do that. So the new Jews from Islamic lands brought in money and knowledge to do that. And so these Jews were offered what's called a charter that would allow them to live within their own communities, practice their own religion without persecution, and basically live a decent life. But they were not allowed to own land or practice the crafts like silversmith or blacksmith or a shoemaker. But they could trade and they could do money lending. So money lending was the key because the Bible prescribed how it could be done even among Christians. We cannot charge interest to our brothers. There was not money available then. However, they could lend money at interest to the heathen. And to them, the Christian were the heathen. Therefore, Europe could expand. However, this is where the roots of Christian anti-Semitism begin to show. There are three main roots: ethnic, religion, economics. So ethnic. Until now, all the Christians in Europe, the Visigoths, the Franks, the Germans, they're the only ethnic groups. They all look alike and they speak the same language. They have the same religion and the same culture. They even dress the same. And all of a sudden, here come these Jews and they wear all black and they speak a different language and they have a different culture and different value system and a different religion. So it creates this shock to this society. And they're like, who are these strange people? Immigrants now, as from years and centuries and millennial past, are always treated with suspicion. And it's because they're scared that they would be changed by the immigrants, or in this case, by the Jews. Not only was the Jewish religion different from the Christian religion, in the Christian's mind, they're the ones who killed our God. At first, the Christians just wanted the Jews to believe the way that they believed. But the Jews weren't interested. There were three factors that kept them from being interested. First one is the Trinity. Judaism is based on the notion that there is one God, the Shema. The most famous Jewish prayer said 3 times a day is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And any way that you present the Trinity, it looks like 3. So another problem with the religion is that the Christians say you're free from the law. The problem is that this is what makes a Jew a Jew. And they're expected to give up this thing that God gave them way back on Mount Sinai. And it's problematic anyway, because no genuine Christian really believes that there are no laws to govern life. If you were free from the law, why wouldn't you steal and kill someone, even if they're not hurting you or influencing your lifestyle? If there's no law, it just doesn't make sense. You know it's wrong, and it would hurt your relationship with Jesus. But where does that wrong come from? From the law. And there's actually more stringent laws in the New Testament than there are in the Old Testament. Like it started out in the Old Testament, don't do murder. But now in the New Testament, Jesus commands, don't be angry with your brother. So this incoherency makes no sense to the Jewish people. And they're just like, yeah, not going there with you. And then the third problem that the Jews had with Christianity is aestheticism. So basically, Christians ascribe to being removed from this world, not participating in worldly activities. Holiness and righteousness and piety were equated with being poor. But the Jews love to party and have a good time. So, and their faith emphasizing having an enjoyment of this life, where Christianity focuses on the afterlife. So with this deal of Christianity, the Jews would have to reject who they are and lived a bummed out life. Like, who's going to say yes to that? And so they said, no, thanks. The third problem that of this anti-Semitism comes from economics. And economics, as we know, is often the final straw. The Jews couldn't own land. They couldn't work the crafts, but they could lend money. To do that, you charge interest. So the lords want more money, and they start to tax the Jews on the profits that they're making. And when the middleman gets taxed, what does he do? He raises interest rates. Well, the peasants were also borrowing money from the Jews to help them get through different situations or difficult circumstances. And they were getting charged the high rates as well. But they couldn't see that it was the lords who had increased the taxes, and the peasants are becoming even more impoverished. And it looks like the Jews are stealing all of their money. So this sets up a scenario that is a potential disaster for the Jews by being in between the lords and the masses. They already look different. They have this different religion. They're acting different. The only necessity is a spark. That spark occurs in 1094 to 1095. So from the 600s to the 1090s, Turkey remains sovereign. This is Byzantium. But the Islamic Empire has taken over so much more of the Middle East and over into the West. In 1054, there had been a split in the church. The Western and Eastern churches officially split, and Eastern Orthodoxy ruled out of Constantinople, and the Roman Catholicism ruled out of Rome. In 1094, Constantinople calls on the Pope to help combat incursions being made by the Islamic Empire into his region. Pope Urban in 1095 issues a decree to all the churches under him, so basically the whole West, to raise up an army to liberate Jerusalem. So what does this have to do with defending Byzantium? He probably just didn't think it was a good enough reason. So his idea was to raise up this army with Jerusalem as it's a better public relations point. And they would stop by Byzantium to help them out on their way to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, to take it back from the infidels. So to shorten the Pope's crazy scripture twisting reasoning, he felt it was okay to kill and to go to war with a people as long as they were not Christian. And this becomes a serious problem for the Jews. As the Christians rise up in an army and sew big crosses on their clothing to go and fight the infidels, they turn around and begin fighting the infidels in our midst, the Jews. In 1096, the First Crusade begins, and there are 9 that will follow. Wherever Jews are found as the Crusaders are moving through Europe, they begin to slaughter entire communities. It started in Worms, Germany, and continued all the way to Constantinople and then to Jerusalem. Thousands and thousands die. Some are given the option to convert if they want, or they die. About this time, a rabbi named Rashi, the greatest Talmudic commentator of all time, and an owner of a vineyard in France, issued a decree to the Jews called the Kiddush Hashem, or sanctification of the name. It basically says that the Jews can commit suicide if the choice that they're forced into is sure death at the hand of the Crusaders or forced conversion through torture. And for the sake of the divine name, they then can kill themselves. In York, during the Third Crusade, Richard the Lionhearted, all the Jews committed suicide to avoid being forcibly converted. And it happened at various other times and places as well. The Crusaders actually mistook some Christians for Jews and tortured and gutted and burned some of them alive too. And when the Crusaders actually arrived in Jerusalem, here they have come to liberate this city, and they arrive, and it's this multicultural city where Jews and Christians and Muslims were getting along famously. Apparently, no one told the Pope that the Christians didn't need help. But July 8th, 1099, the Crusaders attacked and breached the walls of Jerusalem. They took captive all the Jews and threw them in the great synagogue and burned it down. The Jews alive inside. The Crusaders paraded around outside singing, "Christ is worthy, the Lamb is worthy, Christ the Son of God," while the Jews are burning alive inside. The following day, the Crusaders did the same thing then to the Muslims. They rounded them up, threw them in a mosque, and burned it down. It's no wonder that the Jews, even today, for the most part, are not interested in Christianity. So post-Crusade eras, the 9 more Crusades followed the first. And the Crusades are very difficult to understand. But Christianity had been invaded by this idea that war and valor were part of Christian value. Today we have prayer and worship movements or healing movements of the early 1900s. Well, then they had a war and valor movement. I don't know where it comes from, but this kind of conquering idea of being Christ-like. These times alter the caution that had been lived by for centuries from Augustine, which was leave the Jews alone as an example of God's accursed people. Not that that's a great stance either, but at least no one was dying. Now, this anti-Semitic violence invades the church and consumes it for the next 500 years. We're still not completely over it. Wild accusations began, and they even continue to this time. And the same things kept happening over and over again. There's 3 things: blood libel, ritual murder charge, and desecration of the host. So the first one is blood libel. This is the idea that Jews take the blood of Christians, especially Christian children, and mix it with the making of their unleavened bread. And these accusations cause outbreaks of tremendous persecution wherever the Jews live. Slaughters, burning synagogues. It's awful. The second is the ritual murder charge. We do know where this came from. And it starts in England in 1144 AD in Norwich. So a young boy who was a tanner's apprentice goes missing, and it was near Easter. And some maids say that they saw the boy enter some Jewish homes in the city. So there's an investigation, and suddenly they find this boy dead in the woods with stab wounds. And the investigators go to the Jewish homes and they torture them until they admit that they stabbed this boy, and it's a ritual murder to reenact the death of Christ before Easter. It's a myth, and it's not what happened at all. But as a result, thousands more Jews are slaughtered in the city. And these ritual murder charges spread all across Europe for centuries. Even as late as 70 to 80 years ago, this came up in Hungary and Yugoslavia and Kiev. Currently, the Muslims have begun to propagate this centuries-old lie against the Jews. So the third problem is the desecration of the host. And we know where that one started too. In 1215, the Lateran Council ruled that the bread of the communion was actually the body of Christ. Transubstantiation. Okay. Shortly, the Jews were accused of bribing Christians into handing over their communion wafers and then taking the wafers and stabbing them so that they can kill Jesus over and over again because he feels the stabbings in the bread. I just don't even know about that. In 1298, in Germany, in the Rhineland, they even claimed a miraculous bleeding of the host. Interesting. The entire population of Jews in Rantingen, Germany, was burned alive. Then 140 other communities were slaughtered. About 100,000 Jews were killed in 6 months of persecution just from this one lie of the bleeding of the host. The main point of the Lateran Council meeting of 1215 was to try to unify the church because the leaders were concerned about certain heretical groups that had sprung up in the church world from the Crusaders who had gone, and then they brought back these weird ideas and strange thinking from their time abroad in the East. Also, though, good groups such as the Catholics and the Waldenesians, which is the pre-John Huss reformers, they were actually spreading and doing very well at this time. So the church formed a group of special monks called the Dominican Order. And their goal was to investigate and root out heresy wherever they found it. One tactic they used was to go into towns and do an inquisition and torture the people to find the leaders and try them and burn them at the stake. However, they were also concerned about Jews infecting and influencing Christianity. I mean, their goal was to purify the church. So the Jews within their midst were required to wear special clothing with a yellow marker on them. That sounds familiar. But this is the first time that they've been targeted and isolated in this way. The church was also interested in challenging and converting Jews to their faith. So they forced these public debates called disputations. And they involved the leading rabbis versus Jewish converts. And they would last a couple of weeks at a time. And while the rabbis were away from their congregations, the Dominicans or church groups would go in and forcibly convert the congregations or burn down their synagogues. In 1263 in Barcelona, this was a most famous disputation. And the use of a converted Jews in disputations is a major reason that the Messianic Jews today, even the last dozen years, have been so hated by the regular Jewish community. So they couldn't kill them all and they couldn't convert them all. So what's the next step? They want to kick them out of the nations. So here comes the expulsions. England. The Jews were kicked out in 1290 and all assets were seized. In France, the early 1300s, the Jews had to leave all goods and debts owed to them behind. 100,000 Jews were given 1 month to leave. All the jewelry and money was confiscated by the crown. France's motivation was robbery. The king's funds had been depleted by war. And at this point, the Passion plays were very much involved in the thinking behind this. Christians would reenact Jesus' last week on earth on stage near Easter time. They're still doing it like every 10 years right now. The Jews were portrayed as devils in their costumes and their stage makeup. And the producers used modern Middle Ages Jewish names for the characters. So these plays were inciting violence and ill will among the populations, and it was miserable for the Jewish people. Spain in 1248. So Christians retook Spain from the Muslims, and Jewish life in Spain had been pretty good for many, many years under the Muslims. When all this other junk was going on in Europe, you know, the burnings and things, the Spanish Jews were doing pretty well. Even after the Christians came in, the Jews were then used as this like transitional force between the Christians and the Muslims. They helped to govern the region and were well treated. But things began to change with the bubonic plague. It was blamed on the Jews. Then in 1390, 2 leaders in Castile, Spain die, and the Jews are blamed. A horrible pogrom breaks out June 4th, 1391, but hey, it wasn't the 9th of Av. 100,000 Jews are murdered. 100,000 Jews are forcibly converted to Christianity, and 100,000 more leave Spain. They are immigrating out of the country. So, I mean, they're used to getting kicked out of places, but the thing that shocked the Jews the most was so many conversions, 100,000. So the Jews begin to examine their huge erosion of faith. In 1414, there was another mass conversion to Christianity. 50,000 more Jews left Judaism for Christianity. And at the same time, there is this increased fervor in messianic expectation, both for the Christians and for the Jews. Because in 1453, the Hagia Sophia, the massive Christian church built by Constantine in Constantinople, is taken by the Ottoman Turks, the Muslims. Even today, that church is a mosque. And the people just didn't think it could get any worse than that. Little did they know. What they were crying was, the end of time is upon us. The Jews in Spain then, which, I mean, they had had an okay time, and then things really started going bad for them. They're broken into these three groups. You've got your regular Jews, the conversos, which obviously the converted, and this subcategory of conversos called the Morenos. So the Morenos are secretly Jews and outwardly Christian. So once Jews convert to Christianity, there's no limit to what they can do or attain in Spanish society, even nobility. So it becomes very attractive for the Jewish people to convert. There's pressure then, because now there's more competition for the good jobs, better positions, since nothing is withheld from these Jewish converts to Christianity. Then in 1460, a law is passed that differentiates between the old and new Christians. New Christians, those who had converted from Judaism, cannot take these better positions. So now it's no longer a religious difference. They're both Christians. It's a race problem. This comes up again in the Holocaust. So these conversos become very isolated. If they revert back to Judaism, they're persecuted or killed, and then they become really isolated with the institution of the Inquisition. And so it begins. In 1469, Ferdinand from Aragon and Isabel from Castile get married in order to unite the kingdoms and all of Spain. Granada in the south is still held by the Muslims, and the Jews actually support this marriage. Ferdinand's grandfather was a Jew, and they had been treated well by his family. They assumed that the pressure that they were under would relinquish. And in 1479, the kingdoms merged into Spain. 1478, the year before, the Pope made a decree that they were to examine the genuineness of Jewish conversions in Castile. They were concerned that people were converting for the wrong reasons. Well, yeah, you're going to kill them. Of course they're going to convert. In 1481, the Pope established the office of the Inquisitor General in Spain to take care of this little problem he was seeing. And the Grand Inquisitor, his name was Torquemada, and he was from that old Dominican order. The goal was not to target the Jews, but to actually target the conversos, to ensure that their Christianity was pure and that conversions were made for genuine purposes. So they would set up these courts of inquiry in different cities and begin to investigate. They would torture anyone who looked guilty to find out where there were converts who were keeping Jewish traditions. And they tricked the converts in ways, like in the marketplace, they would have people hand a pork product to a converso to see if they would take it. And if not, they were suspected of keeping the Jewish traditions. And they isolated the conversos and tortured them then to find more people. And they'd look for candle lighting in windows on Friday night for Shabbat. And they all lived together at this time, the Jews, the conversos, the Morenos in the community. Thousands of Jews, mainly conversos and Morenos, are now executed at the stake. There are these public confessions and public burnings. The Jews are required to wear special clothes, and horrible torture, such as the rack, was implemented against these folks. Knives under their toenails, horrible things to make sure that these people were not keeping Jewish tradition. In 1491, there was a blood libel that happened in Toledo, Spain. And under torture, the people named several conversos and Jews that were involved in this blood libel. And they said, guess what? There's also this plot to overthrow Christianity. None of this is true. It was just, made up under torture. But suddenly, this becomes a turning point to expel all the Jews out of the country. Again, this is all Spain. January 2nd, 1492. I know that date sounds familiar. The Spanish conqueror, Granada, and they all unified. They have unified Spain under the banner of Christ, with one exception: the Jews. They're the only group left. So Ferdinand issues an order March 31st of that year. He says the Jews have 4 months to get out or convert to Christianity. Hundreds of thousands of them. If they left, they could take no gold, silver money. They couldn't sell their stuff. And the Jews were frantic about what to do. Nobody wanted them. Finally, they raised a ton of money, millions and millions in today's dollars. And they gave it to the treasurer of Ferdinand, who was a Jew. His name was Don Isaac Abravanel. They said, take this money and try to persuade the king, who was his personal friend, to change his mind and let us stay. So when Abravanel approached the king, Torquemada, the Inquisitor General, finds out about it. And he intervenes and arrives first. Torquemada addressed the king and basically calls him a Judas if he betrays Jesus or sells Jesus for the money that the Jews are willing to give him for their lives. He says, I will take no blame. You are responsible to God for this business deal. Torquemada put down a cross in front of the king then and left. Abravanel watched the whole exchange. And Ferdinand refused to change the decree because of Torquemada. Ferdinand does offer to protect his friend Abravanel, but he can't save the Jews. And Abravanel chooses to go with his own people. Portugal eventually agrees to accept 120,000 Jews for 8 months while they make arrangements to move. In August of 1492, turns out that the deadline for them to leave the country falls on the Hebrew calendar date of the 9th of Av. 200,000 leave and 100,000 more convert. When the Jews arrive in Portugal, the king rescinded his agreement He said, your choice is to convert to Christianity or you'll be turned over as slaves. He then ordered the children to be taken from their parents, literally out of their arms. And he sent them via ship to a newly discovered island off of Africa, Sao Tome, which was inhabited by lizards, snakes, and other beasts. And the mothers are not allowed to go. One mother actually threw herself into the sea with her 2-year-old child from the gangplank. And most people then couldn't swim, and she was one of them. So both the mother and the child drowned. So where was the Lord? It's been hundreds of years, and they keep getting kicked out of their homes and out of their countries, the wandering Jew. But the Lord is working secretly behind the scenes to raise up a savior from a very unlikely source. In the late 1400s, there was an adventurous young man who lived in Cologne, Italy. Cologne is a port city. It also happens to be a Jewish city. And in 1484, this young man arrives in Spain because Spain is a major seafaring nation, and he wanted to explore the world. So he quickly kept company with both Jews and Muslims, but especially with conversos. This young man we know as Christopher Columbus. He thought he could get to India via the Atlantic Ocean, which of course is false, but that doesn't matter. What's interesting about Columbus is that he was likely a converso himself. Here's why we think this. There's a lot of evidence for this. So first, his real last name is Cologne, C-O-L-O-N, and that's a Jewish family name. Next, most of his friends were conversos or other Jews. Third, all of his correspondence that he dated, he uses the dating from the destruction of the Second Temple, not the birth of Christ. So everything was 70 years less than what most people were using at this time. So instead of 1485, he would have said 1405. Letters that he wrote to his son, he added at the end of a cipher or code the Hebrew abbreviation for Be'ezra Hashem in English, which means with the help of God. 5, he always had a strong interest in Jewish matters in the country. 6, also in his correspondence from the West back east, he includes many references to the Hebrew scriptures, which was basically unknown at this time in Christianity. 7, he took 6 identifiable conversos on board his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, to the west. Number 8, he spoke Hebrew, and his cartographer was Jewish. All of the notes the 2 of them made on their maps and charts were in Hebrew. And 9th, his original plan was to leave on the 2nd of August, and on the Hebrew calendar that year was the 9th of Av. So he decided to postpone the sailing until the evening after sundown so that he would not be associated with that date. And there were some Jewish teachings that any work performed on that date would come to no good. So like any good Jew knows, sundown marks the day, the beginning of the new day. So he actually sailed on the 10th of Av with, I guess, the tide. And some interesting things happen on board the ships. So Columbus goes south to the Canary Islands on the West African coast to resupply before heading out west. And he leaves in the summer of 1492. He remarks in one of his writings along the way that one particular evening he heard this weird chanting on one of the ships. Then suddenly it springs up on these other ships as well. And it's the beginning of the Hebrew prayer that is prayed only on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And it's called the Kol Nidre, and it means all vows. This is a prayer that is an ancient Jewish prayer that had taken on more importance during that last 100 years. At the beginning of Yom Kippur, Jews were to renounce all the vows that they had made unwittingly during the previous year. And it's a way that the conversos could show God and each other that they were still Jewish and honoring the covenant of their people and of their God, even if they had gone through an experience where they were forced to convert. They wanted to be able to reconnect with the God of Israel. So Columbus hears this prayer by the conversos on his ships as they're traveling across the ocean on Yom Kippur. I mean, wow. Then later, another interesting story comes out from Columbus's chief lieutenant, who happens to be a converso. A couple of weeks later, in September 1492, the lieutenant looks down and sees something floating in the water. He pulls it out, and it's a palm branch. And he thinks for a minute and then suddenly realizes this is the day of the festival of Rosh Hashanah Rabbah, the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, the day that the Jews were to take palm branches and wave them before the Lord and say, "Save us, save us, save us, O God." And this branch was coming from the New World, from near the islands like Jamaica, and it's floating in the water. The beauty of that story is that the New World becomes the salvation of the Jewish people. Even before World War II, when the Americans jumped in and saved the European Jews from being completely wiped out, many got to immigrate to the US in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s. So Columbus, a Jewish Christian, is paving a way for salvation for the Jewish people in the future because he had a heart for his own heritage. And even though he didn't know he was going the wrong way, God said, I can use that. So even if we mess things up or act on false premises, God can use our acts of obedience. After the expulsion from Spain in 1492, the Jews end up getting kicked out of Portugal. They had their 8 months and then they had to go, remember? So some of them go into Brazil, to Holland. Large numbers go into the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, Israel itself. This is the first major group to return to Israel. The Southern Ottoman Empire and the Balkan states, which become Poland and Russia. Russia is a really important group. Many go to Italy, but they're still constantly moving within these regions to different regions because such a large group of them were wandering. I mean, there's 200,000 people. So at first they would be received and then they would stop and then they would be kicked out because there were just too many and nobody could handle them. So the Italy group, they began working in the shipbuilding and iron industries there. Then the Italians began to react to the influx of the number of Jews. There's some rioting, and the authorities end up building little walls around the Jewish settlements in the city to protect them from the riots. They're called ghettos. It comes from the Italian name for an iron foundry, a gatto, G-H-A-T-O. So that's where the name comes from. And there are actually still marked there in Florence and Venice today. And it was built as an advantage for the Jewish people. Didn't turn out that way later, but elsewhere in Europe, the Renaissance is coming about because of the printing press. So there's an increased humanism in Europe. This actually helps the Jews because there's not as much focus on religion now. Then comes the Reformation. This transforms the church and it helps the Jews too, because it basically split their enemy in two. The Christians are now fighting each other and it takes the heat off the Jewish people. So Martin Luther, he started off really well with the Jews. But when they did not accept his gospel, he becomes increasingly anti-Semitic. And by the end of his life, he actually wrote a pamphlet called About the Jews and Their Lies, basically calling them the accursed people. Luther suggests that Christians burn synagogues and bury anything that won't burn so that there's no remnant left to see. Uproot and destroy their houses so that they know they're exiles and accursed. And he says also, let's expel them forever. Hitler actually ends up using Luther's writings and other Christian anti-Semitic writings as a justification for what he does later to the Jews. In 1618, the 30 Years' War breaks out between the Catholics and the Protestants in Europe. The Jews were the moneylenders, and their lending is probably what extended the war, because this money or the profits was still coming from the peasants as it did before. And because of the extreme prolonging of the war, there was this deep, deep resentment toward the Jews. In 1648, a group of Ukrainian peasants joined with the Kazakh peasants and others, and they rose up in rebellion against the Catholics of Poland to break the bondage of the taxation. They wanted to get at the source of the taxation, which was the Jews, because of this money lending. The Polish at first protected the Jews, but eventually they allowed them to have at the Jews in a massacre beyond massacres. Victims were filleted alive, and infants were thrown in wells and buried alive. They removed Torah scrolls from the synagogues and danced on them with whiskey. Even the slightest look of mercy was looked upon as treason, and only 1/10 of the population of Jews survived. And this was once one of the most populous Jewish areas. And until Hitler, this group under Chmielnicki was responsible for the greatest massacre of Jewish life. And the currency of Ukraine still carries his picture. So let's go back to England. So with all this mess that's going on in Europe, Messianic fervor is stirred up again among the Jews and also among the Christians, because it's nearing the year 1666. And you know what that would do to people. So Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans were in this messianic frame of mind and searching for Jesus's return. This was in the years leading up to that dreaded 666 at the end of the 1,000 years. And the people are all alike. They're looking for significance in this year number. And incidentally, it's not God's calendar. So the years are off. So it has nothing to do with anything. But the Christians and the Jews are actually influencing people about what they believe. And the Messiah is expected to appear. And so he does in Gaza in 1665. And his name is Shabbatai Tzvi. Obviously not real Messiah. Okay, so they just think he's Messiah. He's kind of crazy and probably bipolar. And after some good press and some miracles, Tzvi announces that he will present himself to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul and demand that Israel be given back to the Jews. So he asks the Jewish people all over the continent to pray and fast so that it will happen. And these riots start breaking out. The Sultan puts Tzvi in chains when he arrives, and Tzvi is imprisoned. And the Sultan gives him an option to convert to Islam or be killed. He converts. So the ruse was up. And Tzvi was not the Messiah. But it was a crushing blow to the Jews because it seemed like the end was at hand, and things had been so terrible for so long. The Messiah figure shows up, and then it's not him. Such disappointment. But once again, God is working behind the scenes in a quieter way. This time, it's a guy in the Netherlands, Manasseh ben Israel. So he is studying the scriptures, and he's looking for a way to resolve all these East-West Jewish problems. He sees that the West is changing and modernizing and might accept the Jews now. And as he's studying the scriptures, he comes across a passage that the Messiah will come when the Jews spread to the end of the earth. And the same word used for end in Hebrew is the same word used for the nation of England. So the Jews had not been allowed in England since 1290. It's now 1650. So he writes this pamphlet called Hope for Israel. He postulates that if the Jews were allowed into England, that the Messiah will come. And he decides to present this to the English leadership, who at this time in English history are particularly open to this idea. So the Puritan movement had begun and was prevalent in the leadership in England. Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan Commonwealth are in charge. One of the things that they're known for is being millennialists, or experts on the second coming of Christ. And they were actually one of the first groups to ever be pro-Jewish. They had been writing about the Jews for about 80 years. And so this guy gets a meeting with Cromwell and shows him the prophecy in the scripture and says, if the Jews are welcomed back into England, it could fulfill the prophecy and bring about the return of the Messiah. So then Cromwell goes to Parliament and argues to rescind the 1290 law that barred Jews from living in England. And it takes about 2 to 3 years of debates, but they recognize that there have been some conversos living in England for the last 200 to 300 years anyway. So they decided to see what would happen. And they let the Jews come back in. And so the Jews are welcomed back into England in the 1600s due to good salesmanship. Why is this significant? It's because that it's England that begins in the 1580s and continues on into the 1900s as the government that begins to build a case that would return the people of Israel back to the land of Israel. England becomes the nation that leads the children of Israel back home. They force the hand of the world. The Christians in this nation were actually doing this before the Jews were even involved. But before we get to that story, we will need to catch up with Abraham's other son, Ishmael. And in the next episode, we will trace some Arab history, including the founding of Islam, and a very little discussed story about Muhammad's father. And that episode is called Islam and the Palestinian Problem.